Are you looking for the truth? One of the best places to find it is in old stories that have survived the test of time, right? Stories that have been passed down for hundreds or even thousands of years. One of my favorite examples is actually the Holy Bible. I know a lot of people take it for granted because, there's certain connotations with it. People, believe this or that, and it's like very much a religious thing, but it doesn't have to be. Because it doesn't have to be necessarily religious for it to enlighten you, right? To teach you something about the human condition that you wouldn't otherwise understand. There are a lot of really great stories out of it. So today we're going to be trying to get to the bottom of a really interesting question, right? Were humans always this unhappy? Were we always suffering? Has it always been like this? And we're going to be looking at the story of the Garden of Eden to hopefully get to the bottom of this question and see if the Bible can shed some light on this one. Because this is definitely one that I would like answered, and I'm sure you would too. But before we get into that, hello there, my friend. Welcome back to History for Thinkers, a show that brings history to life. I don't know where you're listening. You might be on the podcast. It might be on YouTube. It might be somewhere else, right? It might be on the radio. Right? I'm not running radio stuff, so probably not. But I do want to encourage you to sign up to the newsletter, right? There will be a link to that in the show notes, the description, anywhere you can. That's really the only way that we can consistently, right, maintain contact. Because everywhere else, right, I don't control Apple Podcasts. I don't control YouTube. They can suddenly shut me off for no reason at any time. But that's the really cool thing about email. We can always maintain contact no matter what. And it's really, really hard to shut something down on email. So make sure to sign up to that newsletter. You'll get, updates on episodes, interesting stuff. And I don't send anything out a lot, right? You might get 2-3 emails a month. And on top of that, it's all free, right? I'm not trying to, make a quick buck off of you. So, this is really just about learning history, understanding. And bear in mind, I am learning with you, right? So this is very much kind of the basis of the philosophy of the show. So with all that out of the way, join the newsletter and let's get into the episode. All right, so first things first, we got to start with a very brief overview because I cannot assume any prior knowledge. But bear in mind, this will be very brief. I do encourage you to read everything for yourself. Make up your own mind. Never hurts, right? It never hurts. But here we go. So basically, God makes Adam and Eve, puts them in, basically paradise, right? The Garden of Eden has some pretty nice descriptions of it. It seems like a nice place to be, right? Not quite heaven, but pretty dang nice. But he makes one rule. And the rule is that they cannot eat from the tree of knowledge. It's got these really nice looking apples, but hey, listen, you can't eat it. That's the one rule. Well, God goes away for a little while, and, a snake shows up. And then he tempts Adam and Eve, more or less says, listen, man, those apples look really good. God won't know a thing or two about it if you eat just one. So they give in, they eat the apple, and then, God finds out, because he's God, and then he casts them out of the Garden of Eden. And this is basically the basis of original sin. Right? The idea that we are born with something wrong with us, that we are going to do bad things, that we're not going to live up to God's glory unless we really strive and make an effort to do so. Right? It is very important in Christian theology. I like the way that they later clarify it in Paul's epistle to the Romans when he writes, quote, "Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned." So basically we are all screwed because Adam and Eve had to eat the dang apple, which really sucks because we didn't do anything wrong, right? And now we're all screwed for it? Like, what the hell, man? What kind of deal is that? Now, it's important to get the definitions right here. Sin is one of these super loaded words that I think people can always come to these kinds of discussions with their own idea of what it is. So we're going to be going off of the idea basically from the older translations, right? The way they originally spoke of sin as missing the mark. This is pretty standard, pretty basic, but I think some people used it like interchangeably with things that are inherently evil or bad, right? Murdering someone is a sin, but so can like not doing good when you could be doing good, right? That's also a sin, right? If you can help someone, but you choose not to, that's a sin just as much as like murdering someone is a sin. So if you sin, you are falling short of God's glory by choosing to sin. Kind of important to have that context. But with all that, let's walk through my interpretation of the Garden of Eden. So basically, the Garden of Eden itself is not a place, but it is a way of life. And I'm going to say that it is nomadic tribalism, right? So human beings have existed for 200,000 or 300,000 years, right? At least in our current form. And for most of that time, right, about 99% of it, we lived in nomadic tribes. This is the way that we evolved to live, right? We are a product of evolution, just like any other animal. And this is the way that we were meant to live based on evolution. Now, the tree of knowledge represents agriculture and settled civilization. So what happened was we realized that we didn't have to hunt all the time, right? Because essentially, like if you lived in a nomadic tribe, the reason it was nomadic was because you had to constantly be on the move, trying to find, the next meal, right? Pretty much all your time and energy was spent doing that. There were some other things you did, right? There were some like very primitive tools, right? Making clothes and doing other things that humans do. But for the most part, your time and energy was spent getting food. But when we discovered agriculture, we basically realized that we didn't have to spend all our time doing that. We could have one, or not really one, but like have a few people do nothing but grow food, and they can make enough food for everyone. And then, well, basically all these other people don't have to spend all their time doing food, right? These people can organize society through like government. There are other people can become craftspeople and make even better tools, right? And this is basically, historians refer to this as the Neolithic Revolution, essentially where we became and more advanced, right? I think that's probably the best way to think about it. The only reason I can sit here and make this video right now is because we are a highly advanced civilization, right? I don't have to spend all my time and energy making food, right? I can do like weird things on the computer, right? Kind of fascinating when you think about it. But let's also not ignore the fact that this is not the way we evolved to live. This is not a natural way of life. So Adam and Eve represent the first humans to discover agriculture. Now, I think this point is important, that it is in fact two people, right? It is multiple people, so it can like represent a tribe, right? Adam and Eve do have descendants, and eventually this way of life, right? Settled society based on agriculture, essentially goes mainstream, and like today, pretty much everyone lives this way, right? You can find a few small pockets of people that don't, right? In the Amazon rainforest, the Australian Aborigines come to mind, but right, these are like 0.01% of the human population. Pretty much everyone else lives this way. If you're watching this video, you do live this way too. So the one part that I've actually had a hard time interpreting is this snake. And I'm not entirely sure that I even buy my own interpretation, but this is the best I could come up with. So the idea is that in settled society, because you're not traveling around as much, you don't have to face as many predators, right? A snake is a predator. People are pretty scared of it on average, right? There's always those weird freaks that love them, but most people don't like snakes. And when we discovered agriculture and we didn't have to travel around anymore, right? It was a very like, oh, hey, we don't have to go exploring anymore. We don't have to, randomly run into snakes, right? So in that sense, we can kind of interpret the snake as not necessarily evil per se, but it is something that was motivating people to create an agricultural settled society. And it is important to note that the original story did not say that the devil was the snake. It was not. It was just, this very neutral thing. And I think that is a very important detail to have there. Because a very basic take on it could be like, oh yeah, the snake is obviously the devil, but the book didn't say that, right? The book did not say that. And that's one of the reasons that I do kind of hold true to this idea that there's a lot to this story, right? Very interesting. And then original sin is the inherent suffering that comes with living in an agricultural settled society, an entirely unnatural, alien way of life. So that is a pretty big, bold claim right there. And I do understand that. I do recognize that. And we're going to be going through a lot of research, evidence, data, and talking about why this is the case, or at least I think so. So the question we're trying to answer: were humans always this unhappy? My general thesis is that no. Based on the Garden of Eden story, there was a point in time when humans lived in perfect bliss, right? Or at least something close to it. Again, it's not quite heaven, but it's better than what is now. And with the creation of agriculture and settled society and specialization and all the things that came with the Neolithic Revolution, we have slowly strayed further and further from God's light, making a world that is worse to live in, that is ultimately an uglier place and completely unnatural, right? More or less. So that's my general thesis. All right. So we're going to be starting with life before agriculture. So about 13,000 years ago, no humans lived in agricultural settled societies. That is according to Yuval Harari in *Sapiens*. I know a lot of people have been shooting holes in that book the last few years, but I do think that it is a very interesting read. And this number, right, 13,000 years, that is pretty widely accepted. So, for the sake of this episode, it is close enough. So humans have existed, right, for about 200,000 or 300,000 years, and for the vast majority of that time, this is the way we lived, right? Nomadic, tribal society, right? Think about 13,000 years compared to 300,000, right? Very small time we've had this settled civilization thing. And even when you think about that, right, it wasn't like we suddenly became all settled society at once, right? It was a very gradual, slow process. I mean, even in the 18 and 1900s, people in the Eurasian steppe were still living as nomadic tribal people. So, it didn't happen everywhere all at once. And again, this is the basis of the claim that this is the way that humans evolved to live. This is the way we're supposed to live. Now, part of the thing that makes nomadic tribal life better is that there is no government, no inequality, and no hierarchy. So I know that these are three words that I'm sure we all come with a lot of our own connotations, our own thoughts about these words. We'll be explaining how exactly these three things didn't exist in nomadic tribal society and why that was generally for the better. So let's start with government. So tribes often had less than 100 members, right? That's about the max capacity right there. I'm sure there are examples of tribes that had more than 100 people, but generally that's when things start to break down. That's when you start crossing this path of turning into a formalized, settled society. And the thing about it is that humans developed advanced psychological tools for social coordination, right? We are a very social creature. Right? So we've got, the tribal, the familial bonds. There was also a lot of closeness between people through the gift economy, which is essentially where people just gave each other things so they would survive, right? And I think we can get a really good understanding by comparing it to wolves, right? So wolves, they live in packs. And let's say one wolf goes out and he catches himself a deer. He's got enough food for him and he's well fed, he's good, he's good to go, right? The best hunter in the pack. He is going to let other wolves in the pack eat some of that deer, right? Because the survival of the tribe ensures the survival of him, right? Mutually assured survival. And the same exact thing was going on with humans, right? And that is, broadly how humans evolved to, basically to move around value, right? To exchange things, right? We just gave each other stuff. And there's a whole lot we can say about the gift economy. This is not specifically about that, and we will be talking about that at some point in the future, but that's all we'll say about that for now. The other important point is inequality. So inequality can mean a lot of things. I'm just going to say it like broadly speaking. But during nomadic tribal life, your primary goal was getting food. All right. Again, all your energy is like, oh, hey, we're going to go hunt and we're going to catch food. And like that's all the time we've got in the day, right? That's all we're going to be doing today and probably for the rest of our lives. And if a single person in your tribe had an abundance of food, they shared it with everyone, right? And again, this goes back to the mutually assured survival idea, right? And this was the primary bonding mechanism to enforce tribal unity. So this kept people together. It limited the extent to which some people had more than others, right? Now, there were little bits of inequality, right? So there were people that were more than others during this time, but it wasn't like it was today, right? Because generally, if one person in your tribe was starving, it was a sign that everyone was starving. Whereas today, right, there's some people that are like gazillionaires, and then there's like, thousands of people that are homeless and they don't have enough to eat, dying of starvation. That wouldn't be happening in nomadic tribal times because, the people in your tribe were essentially an extension of your family. All right, so that was nomadic tribal life. Now we are leaving the Garden of Eden. We are starting to take a bite of that apple and kind of come away from the way that God had intended us to live. So one of the things that comes with agriculture is higher populations. And higher populations leads to all kinds of like unintended consequences, right? One of the big ones being economic specialization. So because not everyone has to work on food production anymore, now people can work on other things. One of the very first other things becomes, right, social unity, social coordination, government, more or less, right? Very early phases of the government. Francis Fukuyama put it really well when he wrote, quote, "As little bands of human beings migrated and adapted to different environments, they began their exit out of the state of nature by developing new social institutions." And these social institutions became a very necessary part of life. You just couldn't get by with it, right? Because you think about nomadic tribes, 100 people max, right? And our brains, right, we can process that many people. We can have personal, individual relationships with 100 people. But once you start having hundreds or thousands of people belonging to a single collective entity, well, it becomes really, really hard to have an individual relationship with all those people, right? The human brain can't process that much. So the higher populations cause all these other problems, and basically we've got to create something that is unnatural so we can coordinate this extremely high number of people. Jared Diamond puts it really well when he says, quote, "Large populations can't function without leaders who make the decisions, executives who carry out the decisions, and bureaucrats who administer the decisions and laws." So basically the only way that large populations become possible to like continue functioning in any stable way is with, this really rigid hierarchy, this bureaucracy, all this coordination, right? Because it is just not, otherwise things break down, things get chaotic, things get pretty ugly pretty quick. Now, one of the things that comes with this is the rigid subjugation of each person's will to the system, right? And this renders us powerless against the system. So if you think about it, did you ever sign a social contract, right? Probably not, right? You were just kind of born and you were expected to do certain things, behave certain ways, And no one ever asked you if you wanted this, right? You didn't sign a contract, right? We're just kind of born into this system, and it's kind of forced upon us. And seeing as, again, this is an unnatural way of life, a lot of people understandably kind of have a problem with that. So I think probably the person who put it best was Jean-Jacques Rousseau when he wrote, quote, "Man is born free, but everywhere is in chains." And the core of his philosophy is that people are naturally good, right? The tribal way of life was people at their best, and as we come away from that, we basically enslave ourselves, right? And he does elaborate on this and say that, it really was in the pursuit of freedom that people kind of embraced slavery, more or less. He elaborates and says, quote, "All ran towards their chains, believing that they were securing their liberty, for although they had reason enough to discern the advantages of a civil order, they did not have experience enough to foresee the dangers." And again, the dangers being that now every single human is born into a system that they have no power to change, right? We are forced to live very specific, rigid ways of life. And part of the reason is just because this is the only way it's stable, right? The only way it's going to work is if all these people give up their individuality, they give up their natural human instincts of doing this or that. And this is kind of how life has to be. Otherwise, it's all going to break down, right? My favorite example is all the kids that have ADHD these days, right? Can't pay attention in class, right? No one ever stops to think, oh, hey, maybe little boys and little girls aren't supposed to be sitting in a classroom doing nothing for 8 hours a day. Maybe that's the problem, and it's not all these thousands of kids being diagnosed with this, new disease. It doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. But of course, we never question the system, right? We don't. We were just kind of expected, oh yeah, this is the way life has to be. I'll leave that rant, put a rant check on that one, so we can continue here. And this is kind of where we can get to talk about the tragedy of modern existence, right? Original sin. Not living up to God's glory, not because of not because there's something wrong with us, right? Not because we're not choosing to, but because we're born in a system where it's basically impossible, right? If we think about the Garden of Eden, right? That was God's glory. That was the way of life God wanted for us. Well, we're born in a system against our will. We're forced to participate in that system against our will. And now, by extension of just existing, we are cursed with original sin, right? This is the whole reason that Jesus comes, right? Hey, listen, maybe Jesus is trying to bring us back to that, Garden of Eden-like state, right? We can get as close to that as humanly possible, because that's what human nature is, right? So yeah, everyone born after the fall in settled society is forced to live with countless miseries. Now, I'm not going to go through every little thing that I can think of because this would be a very long episode. That could be a whole other podcast, let's be honest here, because there are a lot of things that make people miserable. I'm actually going to stick with the three big ones that we had talked about earlier. So government, inequality, and hierarchy. So we're going to start with the government, which I think we're all pretty much on board with, right? I know I got a lot of freedom-loving people in my audience. I do appreciate you guys. But yeah, government is, the epitome of not freedom, right? It's the enemy of freedom. Because government has a monopoly on violence. This is the way that, again, this is kind of the only way that this way of life can function, right? Can, basically be stable enough to not collapse immediately. And when you think about it, right, zoom out. Right, or forget about, America or even Great Britain, even Europe, right? Zoom out all of human history, right? At least all of the time that we've had settled civilization, right? All of, about 12, 13,000 years or so. Government has pretty much always been a violent, horrible thing, right? It's never really worked, right? If you think about it, what always ends up happening is the government creates a miserable, toxic system that creates widespread misery in favor of the ruling class. Right? Whoever controls the government inevitably rigs the system for their own benefit. Right? I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. Right? It's pretty universal. Right? Forget about the modern stuff because it's obviously true today. But in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, I mean, any government that has ever existed has always had some corruption, some bad people doing bad things. And this is why so often what ends up happening is these bad systems that the governments create, they often give birth to violent revolutionary movements, and that's where we get this, this continual cycle of history, right? And that's for this simple reason that human beings are incapable of creating a good government, right? And governments are ultimately just unreliable, right? And they failed to maintain social order for, on average, like less than a few centuries, right? And again, this is something that's only existed for like 12, 13,000 years. And if you look at even the best example, right, the best example of the most stable government that has existed and maintained order for the longest period of time was in the Empire of Japan, which lasted for about 1,700 years. Not a very long time, right? Where we've only had government for, again, 12, 13,000 years. The best we can do is like less than 2,000. That's not a very good track record. I do want to point out, though, this is just according to a very lazy Google search. I didn't do a whole lot of research on the longest lasting government. It actually turns out to be a tricky thing, and it depends on how you define it. The Empire of Japan, some people say that it wasn't a single continuous government, right? It's kind of tricky in the weeds. But if you look at like governments even today, right? America is like patting itself on the back all the time for being like the longest lasting republic, right? We don't even have 300 years. That is not something to be proud of in the grand scheme of things, right? So we've had the concept, the existence of government in some way, shape, or form, 12, 13,000 years, and we can barely get something that lasts 1,000 years, right? That is bad. That is very bad. And that, I think, is why people have such a natural aversion to the government, right? People, regardless of whether you're left, whether you're right, something else, pretty much everyone hates the government. And I think this is why. I really think this is why, because it's something that's unnatural and humans have never done right because we can't, right? There's no right way to do this because this is ultimately an unnatural extension of, the need to coordinate thousands and millions of people that really don't have anything to do with each other, right? So that's governments. Moses Finley, who was one of these great historians, I think he just passed away in like 2013. He used to say about the ancient revolutionary movements that the goal was always to, quote, cancel the debts and redistribute the land. And what this means is that, typically throughout all of history, the people that control the government, they rig the system, they make it so they know how to play by the rules to win, right? Because they wrote the rules, and then they get all the stuff, right? Everyone else ends up in debt. They end up without any property, and that's ultimately something that causes a societal collapse, right? Whether that's a revolutionary movement or just, the system just fails, right? Because so many people are dispossessed and living in poverty, right? And what this shows us, right? What this shows us from Moses Finley is that so long as writing has existed as a product of agriculture, there has always been someone saying that we need to violently overthrow the government, right? Because, people try to make it out like revolutionary movements have been, only a recent thing, right? It only started with the communists in the 1900s. No. Revolution is very old. In fact, if you look at it, a lot of their inspiration, right, the communists during their revolution, and even the Americans, right, a lot of people were inspired by, revolutions in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, right? We just don't talk about it as much today because for some reason we don't talk about anything beyond, the 3 or 4 things we do learn about. So that's basically the gist of it. People hate the government because the government always, inevitably, right? Humans run the government. The humans that run the government rig the system to benefit themselves. And then eventually the system gets so bad that it collapses, or people, completely topple it and revolt, right? It's a cycle of history that, it's continued for a long time. Ever since governments have existed, there's been someone that's wanted to tear the government down. All right, I'm going to cut myself off right there because I can go on about ways the government makes life miserable for a very long time. So let's talk about inequality. So, despite agriculture developing about 12,000 years ago, there are still millions of people starving, right? So, and we've gotten very good at agriculture. We are very productive. Like, a few dozen people, a very small percentage of the population actually works in agriculture these days. But despite how efficient they've become, despite producing enough food to feed everyone like 2 or 3 times over, we throw most of it away. And we still have millions of people starving. And essentially that's because we've got this weird unnatural system. This is just, and you can't really blame the people that throw the food away, right? Like, it's not their moral obligation to feed everyone. They're simply responding to, very specific incentive structures. But ultimately this comes back to how humans originally lived, right? Humans bonded through the gift economy, right? Essentially people giving each other stuff, right? People in your tribe, right? It's important to clear up that the gift economy didn't work across the tribe. So generally, if someone was in your tribe and you saw that they were having a hard time getting food, if you had an abundance of food, you took care of them. You just gave them some food because you didn't have a lot of need for it, right? Especially like if you had already eaten, it's like, oh, here, have the rest of this food. You live, you can help me out at some future point, right? And that's generally how it worked. But this today, where, the only way that you can get food is, for the most part, buying it from someone else, right? This is weird. This is kind of a new thing. The gift economy, with the way food worked, it not only solved the poverty problem, right? But it also reinforced sociability because it strengthened the bond between people. When someone helps you, you're more likely to help them back, right? I know there's like a famous self-help thing about it, right? Do someone a favor and, they'll do you a favor, right? All this. And part of the reason it's so popular is because that is actually true. You help people that help you. And that is, that's how it went. But because the people that grow the food, there's no way that you can help Walmart, right? You can't help whatever grocery store in any meaningful capacity. So they don't have any reason to feed you, right? It's not their problem, right? You got to pay for your food or get out, right? But I do want to hit on this actually minor point because it is important. The gift economy didn't altogether disappear with settled society, but its evaporation became possible with it, right? Which is exactly what happened, right? We don't really have any remnants of the gift economy. We've got, the way our brain works, the way our brain is wired, it's still for the gift economy, right? This is the way we're supposed to live, but we don't have it anymore. But yeah, that is a fairly tangential point. We'll worry about that another time. But here's kind of the one big thing with inequality. The abolition of the gift economy destroyed one of the most powerful tools of social coordination, the tribe, leaving humans to rely on other ways to organize themselves. So we don't have this way to, encourage social coordination with the gift economy, with this natural way that human beings have always done things. And now we have to turn to other stuff, right? And one of those other ways is hierarchy, right? Everyone's favorite thing, right? So I am going to take the most negative approach to defining hierarchy as I possibly can and say that it is the subjugation of a person's will to another on an arbitrary basis. All right, a lot of people try to put a much more positive spin on it, and they'll say things like, oh, hierarchy is just like the social order. Well, if you think about it, it's not the natural social order. It's not how people existed in the Garden of Eden. But it is how we exist today, right? It is how we exist today. And as people evolved, right, there would typically be a single man that controlled everything, right? A monarch or a king. And of course, this person always tended toward incompetence, right? Who is fit for such a role, right? And the only person that could think that they are fit for such a role, probably not a good person, right? Probably don't have a very good connection with reality, right? So that's kind of one of the rough things about early government, right? You always get bad people in charge, and really think about it today, we've still not figured out how to get good people in power, right? Even today, it's like we've had governments for about 12,000 years, still don't know how to get good people in charge, right? Still don't know how. And the thing about it is when subjects disobeyed, violence became necessary to enforce the will of the king or the state. And this is something that was very early development with the existence of government. And it's, this is basically the basis of law enforcement and the military, right? So law enforcement will continue enforcing the will of the state regardless of how incompetent the rulers or how cruel the laws. And that's kind of the sad thing about it, right? Because who draws the line? At what point do you say, oh, hey, this government is horrible, it's corrupt, it's creating a bad system, people are suffering under it, we should, and they don't give us any opportunity to meaningfully change it, so what do we do, right? Becomes a very tough question, right? We start thinking about it like that. It's a very weird rabbit hole to go down. So life with agriculture and everything that comes with it has been pretty bad, right? And we got to ask ourselves, were humans always this unhappy, right? And I'm going to say no. I think that the Garden of Eden, or the nomadic tribal way of life, was much better. And the only way to determine which was better, right, whether it was settled society or the nomadic tribalism, is we need to study the people who had experience with both and favored one or the other, right? Because we can look at all the science and data and the evidence and all, we look at that kind of stuff all day long, but when people have on the ground experience, they've lived in one, they've lived in the other, and they made a decision, what do they pick? Well, that gets very interesting, because nearly every example that is in recorded history shows that people prefer the nomadic tribal way of life. What do you know? Which is weird, right? It's not what you would expect, right? When I first went down this rabbit hole, this is not the answer I was expecting to find. But it is just about, every example I've ever seen. I'm sure there is a counterexample, but every example I've ever seen has pretty much always been, oh yeah, people do prefer the nomadic tribal way of life, right? They want to go back to the Garden of Eden. Now, one of the most abundant cases is, the intersection of Europeans in the New World, because this was really when there was this clash of the old world and the new, right? Not just, in the way that we've traditionally thought about it, but it's like the clash of, people that are living in the Garden of Eden and people who are not, right? It is this, original sin is basically invading someone else's Garden of Eden. Very interesting, right? And one of the interesting things about it actually came from the European colonists who regularly deserted the colony to live with the Native Americans, right? This became such a common thing that it led to frustration and violence. Quick side point, I won't make it too long, but when the European colonists came here, people like to say, oh, the European colonists were so evil, right? They were such terrible people. They were violent, gruesome, murderer. I don't buy that. I don't think that framing them as such is productive to any conversation, right? There are bad things that they did, but one of the roots of all this violence came from all of this frustration that, oh yeah, people do actually prefer this other people's way of life. Now, to understand why this violence took place, we got to look at a quote from Edmund Morgan. I believe he was an American historian, and he put it in a really powerful way, and he wrote, quote, If you were a colonist, you knew that your technology was superior to the Indians. You knew that you were civilized and they were savages. But your superior technology had proved insufficient to extract anything. The Indians, keeping to themselves, laughed at your superior methods and lived from the land more abundantly and with less labor than you did. And when your own people started deserting in order to live with them, it was too much. So you killed the Indians, tortured them, burned their villages, burned their cornfields. It proved your superiority in spite of your failures. And you gave similar treatment to any of your own people who succumbed to their savage ways of life. So this right here, basically jealousy. The idea that Europeans, they came in, they kind of had a superiority complex, which is true. They absolutely did. And they came in, they got showed up, right? They basically epically failed. I mean, you go read about the early colonies, especially in North America. I mean, Roanoke, right? People, it was just really hard for people to survive, right? So many colonial attempts just outright failed because the Europeans just couldn't do it. And then you look at the Native Americans, it's like it came easy to them, right? And it makes sense, right? They've lived here for thousands of years. This is where their ancestors literally come from. Of course, they know how, the best way to live off the land. So Europeans escaping to live with the Native Americans was common for centuries. I mean, this just becomes a very regular occurrence with all the cross-cultural contamination. And pretty much, again, it all goes one way, right? People prefer one way of life over the other. We've got a good quote here by Benjamin Franklin. He writes in his private letters, quote, "When an Indian child has been brought up among us, taught our language, and habituated to our customs, yet if he goes to see his relations and make one Indian ramble with them, there is no persuading him ever to return. And that this is not natural nearly as Indians, but as men, is plain from this, that when white persons of either sex have been taken prisoner young by the Indians, and lived a while among them, though ransomed by their friends, and treated with all imaginable tenderness to prevail with them to stay among the English, yet in a short time they become disgusted with our manner of life, and the care and pains that are necessary to support it, and take the first opportunity of escaping again into the woods, from whence there is no reclaiming them. One instance I remember to have heard, where the person was to be brought home to possess a good estate, but finding some care necessary to keep it together, he relinquished it to a younger brother, reserving to himself nothing but a gun and match coat, with which he took his way again to the wilderness." So there you have it. Yeah, even Benjamin Franklin is saying it pretty clear as day. Every example that I know of, everyone goes one way. People just want to live in the woods, right? And this that last example he talked about where someone had a good estate, right? This is a rich guy. This is someone who inherited a really nice, good estate. He's born into a rich family, doesn't even want it. Even being rich amongst the Europeans is not as good as being like a regular person in Native American society. Very interesting. So another example, there was a Spanish woman, Helena Valero, who was living in Brazil, right? She was eventually abducted by the Yanomami tribe, which is like a tribe, living in Brazil. They're essentially like a very, living the primitive way of life. And she lived amongst them for years, until she was eventually returned home to her natal family. Well, after some time, she actually returned to live with the Yanomami because she actually preferred that way of life. Again, another example. So those are a few good examples of people preferring the Native American way of life. What did the Native Americans actually say about the European way of life, right? We got a little glimpse of that with the Benjamin Franklin quote, but what did the natives who lived their way, what do they think about the European or American way of life, right? So there was a Wendat tribe member named Kadiaronk. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it, and I'm too lazy to look it up. And Kadiaronk criticized Europeans for essentially being slaves to a single man, right? Again, goes back to that hierarchy we talked about, right? A single king, a single person, and everyone else's will is subjected to that person. Now, this Native American tribe member allegedly wrote, quote, "I find it hard to see how you could be much more miserable than you already are. What kind of human, what species of creature must Europeans be? They have to be forced to do good and only refrain from evil because of fear of punishment." So this one is, that's kind of a spicy quote, right? It puts it really powerfully. But I do want to be honest and point out that I think this was, I think it came from a book called Jesuit Relations, which was essentially the French colonial people in what is today Canada. And one of the things about it is that we're not 100% sure that this, Kadiaronk said this, right? He may have. This could very well be what he said, and that is how it's presented in the book. With that being said, it is not definitively proven. Someone could have just put words in this guy's mouth and, this was a European saying this about European society. Wouldn't be too hard to say, too much of a stretch of the imagination. But I did want to point that out. Personally, I do think that this probably was an honest reaction to the European way of life. So Europeans regularly envied the Native American way of life, noticing that they had true freedom. Now, this is one of those weird things because freedom can be defined in so many different ways, and it's really hard to get one clear, concise definition of freedom. But a lot of Europeans at the time felt like, oh, hey, these people are actually free, and we're not, right? Again, it goes back to hierarchy and, the complete subjugation of one person's will to, the government or the monarch, or just your boss, right? Everyone answers to someone. Now, Father Lalemant, who was a French Jesuit missionary in 1600s Canadian colonial territory, he noticed some interesting stuff about the Native American way of life. He writes, quote, "The savages have never known what it was so solemnly to forbid anything to their people under any penalty, however slight. They are free people, each of whom considers himself of as much consequence as the others, and they submit to their chiefs only insofar as it pleases them." So again, this kind of shows that they, the Native Americans, they do have chiefs. They do have people that call the shots and make decisions, but they only listen to them if they want to, right? Did the chief make a compelling argument? Do they have a good reputation as someone who makes good decisions? And if not, not going to listen, right? Not going to listen, right? Imagine that you or me tried to do this today, right? Oh yeah, listen, I don't really like the president. I don't buy their policy agenda. I don't buy them, right? I think they're a scam. I think they're a clown. So I'm going to disobey them, and I'm only going to listen to the president if I want to, right? What happens, right? What happens? Well, men with guns are going to come, kidnap you, hurt you, torture you, shoot you, or maybe kill you. Maybe some horrible combination of all those things, right? And this is something that did not really happen with Native American society. And this kind of illustrates something important, right? The European way of freedom is freedom before the law, which means equality before the sovereign, which is to say equality in subjugation. So we are equal in the sense that we can be, terrorized by whoever calls the shots. But in Native American society, well, they were free to submit to their chiefs if they wanted to. If they wanted to. I'm so jealous. I just wish I could, I only have to obey someone if they have good ideas, right? What a wonderful way of life, man. What a wonderful idea. So the contrast between these two ways of life is representative of the difference between life before and after original sin. Again, going back to the Garden of Eden. There was no violent U.S. government in the Garden of Eden, right? Adam and Eve didn't have to pay any taxes. It was just a very fun, wonderful way of life. So, let's come back here. Biblical stories tell us grand, powerful truths about us and the world around us. These stories have existed for thousands of years and have remained relevant into the modern day, right? And that kind of brings us back to the question, right? Is this the truth that was behind the Garden of Eden story? Is this what was really going on behind the scenes? The original authors of, this story, right? We don't really know who that is, right? Whoever they were, presumably inspired by God. Is this the truth? Is this the reason that this story has existed for so long, right? Because this is from the Old Testament, and the Old Testament, those stories are, God, older than 2,000 years, right? At the very least. Really think about the significance here, right? This story has resonated with so many people for so many generations. You know what? I don't know. I really like this interpretation of the Garden of Eden. I think it's very interesting. It's fascinating. I really hope that one day we have more research and evidence and data on the nomadic tribal way of life, because, it really just sheds so much light on the human condition, right? The way we live, the way we're supposed to live, right? These are very big questions that are worth thinking about. But with that being said, I do want to pass the question off to you. Is this the truth behind the Garden of Eden story, right? Because again, this is just my interpretation. This is just the way I see things. And I've used a little bit of research and evidence to back that up. But what do you think, right? What is your take? Because, any other way is just as valid an interpretation of the story. And that's what's so great, right? That is what's so great about these kinds of stories, that there are so many different ways to interpret them and kind of shed light on different aspects of the human condition. But that's going to be it for the episode. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. Make sure to follow History for Thinkers wherever you get your podcast feed, or maybe you want to subscribe on YouTube, right? You want to see the lovely face cam, right? Very nice, high quality face cam. I don't have the best lighting, but I do have a good, nice little face cam here, right? It's not really nice. It's just the one that comes built into my computer. But anyway, follow History for Thinkers wherever you get your show. And thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.